Good morning, congregants. Let's hear a hallelujah. This morning we are going to praise uncertainty and doubt and the vastness of our ignorance. So I want to start with a show of hands. How many people have heard of the deep field observation by the Hubble telescope? Terrific. Okay. So it's less than 50%. For those of you who don't know, the Hubble telescope in 2003, it's in a geosynchronous orbit, it's going around the planet, and NASA decided what they want to do was pick a dark spot in the sky where they can't see anything, and they want to point the finely honed lens of the Hubble telescope at that little spot and figure out if they might be able to see something there. If they really look hard, can they capture some photons? And can they maybe see a star where they thought there wasn't anything? So they picked at random a little dark spot in space that was away from any Earth shine and away from any galaxy dust. And every time the Hubble telescope came around the Earth, they pointed it at that little patch which was about the size of a pencil tip at arm's length. And they did that many hundreds of times, and in total they collected 1 million seconds worth of data. And at the end, they exposed the image, and what they found in that little absolutely black spot of sky was not a star. They didn't even find a few stars there. What they found were 10,000 galaxies. Now, a galaxy is 100 billion stars. And what they found in this little patch of space was thousands of billions of suns, just like our own, right? And think about all of the extrasolar planets, all of the planets around all of those stars. In that little patch of space, just imagine how it's teeming with life, how much activity is going on there. Now you might ask, well, why doesn't NASA just go ahead and map out the whole sky at that resolution? It's because it would take 1 million years to get the whole sky at that resolution. But what we know is that if we pick any random spot, that's what we're finding there. And I think this is a very important consciousness raiser to think about the vastness of our ignorance. So I've spent my whole life as a scientist, and I figured at a young age that if we were trying to understand the blueprints around us, trying to figure out what we're doing here, because we have such a mysterious existence, that there's no better way to go about it than to study the blueprints of what's around us, right? Because our existence is so strange. You feel like you've always been here, you don't really remember getting here, you're told that you won't be here at some point. And so I figured I'd study the blueprints, and in fact science has been the most tremendously successful approach we've ever taken. We have tripled lifespans, and we have gotten men to the moon, and we have wiped out polio and smallpox. We invented the internet. It's been unbelievably successful. But what you really learn in the life of science is that when you're walking out on the pier of science and you get to the end of that pier, that there's an end point beyond which it's all uncharted waters. So what you really learn in the life of science is the vastness of what we don't know, because those uncharted waters go on for as far as the eye can see. And what we know, for sure, is so vastly outstripped by what we do not know. So that's what you get from a life in science. So what's been interesting to me is this spate of books that have come out by the neo-atheists, by Dawkins and Dennett and Hitchens and Harris. These are tremendous books, and they're very important. But the interesting thing is they've left the public with some sort of misconception that scientists can't gamble around beyond the existing data. It's left the public with the misimpression that scientists are acting like, okay, we've got it all figured out. We've figured this out, we know F equals ma and E equals mc squared, and we've sort of got it. And it runs the risk of throwing out the baby with the bathwater, where the baby is all of the awe and the wonder that gets us into science in the first place. So, for those of you who have read these books carefully, let's say Richard Dawkins, you know that Richard Dawkins is actually quite careful. And on his scale of atheism, where 7 is strict atheist, he calls himself around a 6 because he's very smart and he's very careful. But the problem is, most people that you talk to on airplanes believe that scientists are acting like they've got it all figured out. And so that ends up being a little bit of a problem. So the truth is that scientists are the maximally open-minded types because this is the terms of the agreement that we have with Mother Nature. We often find ourselves in situations where there are multiple hypotheses, multiple narratives for what might be going on, and we have to deal with the fact that sometimes we can't gather evidence that weighs in on these. So that's what we do every day in the laboratory. We try, we go out and we seek evidence to weigh in favor of certain narratives over others. But it turns out that we can't always find that, and there are a lot of questions that end up right at the borders of science and those that are beyond the ken of science. And so we're very used to that. And so the scientific temperament then is one of tolerance for multiple ideas at the same time. As one example, for those of you who know about quantum mechanics, there are 2 interpretations for explaining why the fabric of reality is the way that it is. There's something called the Copenhagen interpretation, and then there's the multiple worlds interpretation. And nobody knows which is correct, and we may never know. And that's okay, because those are the terms of the agreement that we have. So instead of throwing out the baby with the bathwater, it seems like maybe there's a new way that one can be a scientist and not have to write a book that acts as though we've got it all figured out and that the whole thing is done. And that's a book that revels in the uncertainty and the vastness of what we don't know. So that's the idea, because I've not been able myself to commit to the position of being a strict atheist because of everything that we don't know. It seems like we just don't have enough knowledge to assume that the universe is nothing but the physical laws that we've figured out, all following themselves to the lowest potential energy, and that's all that's happening. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, I'm not a religious person either, because there are 2,000 religions on the planet, and it's very easy to, it's like shooting fish in a barrel to look at the problems with committing to a particular story. We don't know enough to commit to atheism, but we know way too much to commit to one of these stories. So these religious stories, these holy books, some of them crystallize very hard-won wisdom, and they're beautiful stories, but they were written by people who lived millennia before we knew anything about quantum mechanics or bacterial infection or the size of the cosmos or information theory or electricity or the Big Bang, all of that. They didn't know any of this. In fact, they didn't even know very much about neighboring landscapes or cultures, right? So there are a lot of problems over here, and the neo-atheists have done a terrific job of pointing out what some of those problems are. And of course, the funny part is, when I sit next to people on airplanes, I always ask them about the Hubble Deep Field Observation, and essentially nobody's heard of that, but everybody is willing to defend their religious story, whatever they grew up with. And it doesn't take an anthropologist to realize that nervous systems absorb whatever culture they're born into. So if you're born in Saudi Arabia, you're going to love Islam. And if you're born in Rome, you're going to absorb Catholicism. And if you're born in Tel Aviv, it's Judaism. In India, it's Hinduism. In Springfield, Ohio, you'll be a Protestant. It's no accident that you don't have a lot of Muslims born in the middle of Springfield, Ohio, and not that many Protestants in Saudi Arabia, right? It's because you absorb whatever your culture teaches you. Now, the crazy part is that people come to fight and die over this. They end up believing in their particular version so strongly that they are willing to come to arms over this sort of thing, which is pretty strange. So, as Ralph Waldo Emerson said, the religious stories of one generation become the literary entertainment of the next. Right, so we look at all the gods like Isis and Osiris and the Roman and Greek Panoply. I mean, is anyone fighting and dying over that? Not so much anymore. So when you look around at the different creation stories, there's a I wonder if any of you know the creation story of the Bakuba kingdom of the Congo. Their story, their creation story is as follows. There was a white giant named Mombo, and he had a sharp pain in his belly one day, and he vomited up the stars and the moon and the sun. I'm not making this up. He was still suffering from his illness, had another pain in his stomach, and then vomited up people, animals, and trees. And included in that second ejaculation was, and I quote, I'm not making this up, I quote, the leopard, the eagle, the first woman, the anvil, the monkey fumu, man, medicine, firmament, and lightning. This is what came up. Okay, well, if you find that an unlikely creation story, just keep in mind that if you were of the Bakuba kingdom, you would find the Western story about the naked couple and the talking snake and the prohibited produce just as bizarre, right? And presumably, if you were of the Bakuba kingdom and living in Kansas, you would be arguing for Mombo the white giant to be in the textbooks that your children read, right? So the thing about the story of Adam and Eve is, I'm not suggesting the story of Adam and Eve is somehow wrong just because there are competing stories. It's wrong because the weight of available scientific evidence weighs against it very strongly. So the weight of evidence suggests that the Earth is very old, about 4.5 billion years old. And the biblical account says it's about 6,000 years old. Well, the problem with the biblical account is it has to account for the fact that the Japanese were making pottery and the Magdalenians were painting caves in France and the Persians were domesticating goats 4,000 years before the planet existed. Like somebody forgot to tell them that. So it just doesn't match up with the facts. That's the sense in which we can bring science to the table and try to rule things in and out. So given these crazy stories, and given the fact that there are 2,000 of them, and given this notion that a lot of people have recognized in these books recently that we all know what it's like to be an atheist, because even religious people know what it's like to be an atheist, because they only need to look at somebody else's religion and they say, well, that's patently ridiculous that you believe that. But of course, they're looking at your religion and thinking the same thing, right? That should be clear if you put yourself in the shoes of the stranger, that that's what's happening. So given this, I've been surprised by the amount of certainty that you find when you go into a bookstore, for example. All you find are the books by the neo-atheists, and you find the books by the fundamentally religious. And they argue against each other, and they polarize each other, right? So they spend all of their energies debating this thing about God versus no God. And my message to you this morning is that a modern discussion should go so far beyond this issue of God versus no God. The size of the possibility space is so much more enormous than that I cannot believe that smart people are wasting their energies with what I believe is a false dichotomy, that these are the only two options. So, if we consider a space of all the possible stories, anything that could explain our mysterious existence here, imagine that the whole Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition is one point in that space, and the Eastern religions are one point in that space, and the strict atheist idea that we shut down and go to sleep when we die, and that's the end of it. That's a real possibility, but that's one point in that possibility space. And now if you try to imagine all the landscape in between, you try to imagine all the rest of the possibility there, what you can see is there's a lot of room there. So the bottom line is we have too little knowledge to commit to atheism. We have too much knowledge to commit to a particular religion. And so as far as I can tell, that puts us somewhere in the middle. Now some people call that agnosticism. Some people say, oh, well, I kind of agree with that, I'm an agnostic. I think agnosticism is usually used as a weak term. It usually, as it's used, means I'm not sure whether the guy with the beard on the cloud exists or doesn't exist. My parents taught me this, I kind of have doubts, maybe it's not true. So I don't call myself an agnostic. I call myself a possibilian. And the idea with possibilianism is it's an active exploration of new ideas, and it's trying to understand the structure of that possibility space. So possibilianism is now 1 year old. I first announced this position on National Public Radio in America. It was a live national interview, and I talked about possibilianism. And I left the studio and I went back to my neuroscience laboratory, and I settled in at my desk for a day of work, and I opened my email, and I had over 100 emails from people saying, "Hey, I think I'm a possibilian also." And so I started thinking, well, maybe I'm on something here. So I Googled the word 1 year ago, and the word did not exist. So I did what anybody would do, and I bought possibilian.com. And then I watched, and I waited. And what happened has been something really incredible, which is now there are over 5,000 hits on possibilianism. There are tons of Facebook groups. People talk about it on Twitter, on the blogosphere all the time. And it's been written up places from New York Times to just recently someone showed me the newspaper in Uganda, which had a giant, beautiful article about possibilianism. Why Uganda? I have no idea. And what's been interesting to me is online with these Facebook groups and so on, some people misheard what I said on the radio or they misremembered. So people have started possibility groups, but they've also started the possibilitarians and the probabilians and the people, and they spell it every variety of way. And I thought, you know what? That's perfect. That's exactly in the possibilian spirit. Any way you want to go. So, but the thing that's interesting to me is why possibilianism has caught on like it has. I mean, it's a joke movement, right? We specifically don't adhere to any particular services or gospel or anything, this event notwithstanding. So why is it caught on? I think it's because people are maybe a little bit tired of the debates between the neo-atheists and the religious, between Dawkins and the Discovery Institute, with this, what I'm suggesting is a false dichotomy between, well, there's no God, there's God. And there's so many more possibilities in that space in between. And so the idea is to start shining a flashlight around that space and figuring out the structure of it. Now I want to emphasize, possibilianism is not about anything goes. So some people hear the possibilian gospel and they say, oh, that's terrific, I'm so glad that you're with me on believing in ESP or something. But the fact is, possibilianism is about anything goes at first, but we use the tools of science to figure out the structure of the possibility space and to rule out parts of the possibility space. So the idea is we use what we can to gather evidence to try to figure out the story about what's going on. And if there's something that's testable, like ESP would be terrific if it existed, right? We don't love that. But you can put that sort of thing to the test, and people have, and there's zero evidence for it. So certain parts of the possibility space get ruled out, or at least weighted less than others. So it's not that any fruity idea goes, it's that it remains in the possibility space until we can do something about it. We don't have to believe everything, but really with the idea of possibilianism, there was a, Russell and Whitehead, the philosophers, about a century ago, said the following, which I think is exactly right. They said, you know, if you're going to have some sort of spirituality, you may as well predicate it on the bedrock of what we already know to be true. So we know so much now about the size of the cosmos. There are a sextillion stars in the cosmos. We know so much about the DNA that's inside every single cell in your body. We know so much about information theory and computation and what happens at the levels of microbes and so on. Why not predicate religion on that and start making up stories that are even better? And Carl Sagan actually pointed this out. He said he was really surprised that religions had not taken on the discoveries of science and incorporated those and said, you know what? It's more wondrous than we ever thought. The universe is even better and bigger than we had originally suspected. Now, the reason religions haven't taken that on, that's another story. I mean, it's presumably that it might be a threat to their particular stories. But that would be the idea with possibilityism, is start with what we know and do an active exploration of new sorts of ideas. Now, possibilityism picks up a little bit where science leaves off. So it says, here's what we know, and now here's where we're going to explore. And I think the reason we need to make up new stories and be very tolerant of having a big swath of ideas is because there are so many things that we're missing. So in every generation of science, we always think we have all the puzzle pieces, right? We always think, okay, well now we're the generation lucky enough that we've kind of got all the pieces and parts. Force equals mass times acceleration, here we go, Newtonian physics, Einsteinian physics, we're gonna put it all together and we're gonna figure this bad boy out. Well, in fact, it's never been true for any previous generation. Just imagine trying to understand the aurora borealis in the absence of knowing what the magnetosphere is, or understand something about electron tunneling before knowing what quantum mechanics is. Or even trying to understand a computer that you find if you don't know what electricity is. I mean, in every previous generation, they've been missing such big pieces of the puzzle. And, so people, for example, thought that the heart was a furnace until the discovery of the pump. And then they realized, oh, the heart's actually a pump. Right? But until you have the technology of the pump, until you have that idea, you can't possibly incorporate that into your view. So the point is, do we really think that we are the first generation lucky enough to have all the pieces of the puzzle? Well, that can't possibly be true. And with that recognition that we can't possibly know everything, it commends a certain humility about how we go about things, about not committing to a particular story and fighting and dying for it, but instead holding a little bit of humility. Now, there are puzzle pieces that we don't even know we don't know. Right? But we also have the puzzle pieces that we are damn well aware we don't know. So for example, my field is neuroscience, and we're trying to figure out consciousness. We're trying to figure out how you put together hundreds of billions of pieces and parts, and you get something interesting out of that. Like learning memory and vision and time perception and private subjective experience. Right? So the brain is the most complicated device we have ever found in the universe. And it's made of hundreds of billions of cells called neurons, which are just like all the other cells in your body, except they've got these specialized processes coming off of it for fast sending of signals. And every single neuron in your brain, every one of these tens of billions of neurons, has the entire human genome in it, and it's trafficking millions of little proteins around and inserting them in the membrane. It's got full biochemical cascades on the inside. Each neuron in your brain is as complicated as the city of London. And each of these has about 10,000 connections with neighboring neurons, which means there are hundreds of trillions of connections. If you took a little cubic millimeter of brain tissue, there are as many connections in there as there are stars in the Milky Way galaxy. So it's a tremendously complicated system we're talking about, and somehow this vast, wet, chemical network is us. Now that sounds strange, except we know it's true, because if you damage your pinky in an accident, you're sad about it, but you're no worse off for it. It doesn't change you. But if you damage an equivalently sized piece of neural tissue, that changes you completely. It changes your capacity for decision making, or your ability to see colors, or to name fuzzy animals, or to understand music. All of these things change when you change brain tissue, and of course people universally administer alcohol and narcotics and cigarettes and all sorts of things to change their brain chemistry, to change their consciousness. So somehow we know that this 3-pound organ inside this armor plating of the skull is the densest representation of you. That all your hopes and desires and dreams and aspirations are contained in this 3 pounds of squishy electrochemical signaling computational material. And yet, in 2010, we still don't understand how that works. Not only do we not have a theory of how the brain works, we don't even know what such a theory would look like. So this is the sort of puzzle piece that we know we don't know. We're right up against this stuff. And just by a show of hands, how many people know what dark matter is, or dark energy? Okay. Well, it turns out that when you look at the visible universe and you do the calculations, you figure out how planets are moving around and how they should be moving around. Turns out that we have underestimated the gravitational pull that's going on. We can tell by the way things are interacting with each other that there's more gravity somehow than can be explained by the things that we see. So, you know, that's like a fudge factor in the equation when you say, okay, well, we thought there should be this much gravity, but it appears that maybe there's a little bit more. But it's not exactly a fudge factor. 90% of the matter of the universe, we don't know where it is, where it's coming from, and we put that under the label of dark matter. And by dark matter, we mean we don't know what it is. We can't see it, we can't detect it in any way other than we have to presume its existence, because otherwise none of the equations work out. So anybody who pretends, anybody who's over here in the strict atheist camp and says, oh yeah, we got it all figured out, we know what's going on, it's simply not the case. There's so much that we don't know. When you look at something like quantum mechanics, what it has taught us really is that the fabric of reality is so much stranger than we will ever be able to wrap our heads around. Because our brains have evolved at a particular spatio-temporal scale. So we've evolved at a scale where we can chase rabbits and mates and pick apples from trees, but we are not at a scale where we can understand what's going on at the infinitely small or infinitely large. Those things blow our mind because that's the real fabric of reality, and we're only seeing a little tiny strip of it. As you probably know, you know, at the back of your eye, you have photoreceptors pick up certain kinds of signals, and you're picking up a very thin little slice of the electromagnetic radiation spectrum. And it's about 1/billionth of that spectrum. That's what your eyes pick up, and that's what we call visible light. So the light that's bouncing off that you're seeing me, that's electromagnetic radiation, which is exactly the same stuff that your cell phones pick up, or your radios pick up, or your televisions pick up. It's the same stuff, it's EM radiation. But this stuff we can see, so we treat it specially and we call it visible light. This other stuff you can't see only because you do not have specialized biological receptors for it. So it's completely invisible to you. It passes right through your body. All the cell phone conversations in London are passing right through your body right now. They're totally invisible to you because you don't have specialized receptors for it. Okay, so this is the situation we find ourselves in, is that we're seeing a very tiny slice of what's going on. And this is the reason that I call myself a possibillion. Sometimes people ask me if possibillianism is compatible with a scientific career. In fact, it is the heart of a scientific career. Because if you read the textbooks, it turns out they are sort of a lie. Because the scientific histories always suggest that science went in a linear process. Somebody discovered this and the next person discovered that. Turns out it never works that way, ever. Science is always done, every great scientific finding you can imagine is always done by somebody making a creative leap. And that's what we do every day in the laboratory. You go in and you say, I'm going to make up the wackiest story I can think of, and you jump to some island, and then you look back at what we know and you try to build a bridge back here. And when you can, that's progress. That's how science actually moves forward. More often you end up on islands that are really interesting, and we often don't have enough data to build a bridge back there, to gather evidence to weigh in favor one way or the other. So we end up with a whole archipelago of islands with really interesting ideas on them. So it's compatible with the idea of a scientific career. And sometimes people ask me if being a possibillion is the same as being a Mysterian. And a Mysterian is somebody who thinks that the big questions will never ever get solved. And I don't necessarily think that's the case. The fact is that we have no idea how far we'll be able to build out the pier of science. We'll certainly continue to build it out a few more slats in each generation. The thing is, we don't really have any guarantee how far we'll get. And what I think we can know for certain is that in our brief twinkling of a 21st century lifetime, we're not going to get very far given the size of the uncharted water. So I think we can rest assured that we're not going to know the answer in our brief twinkling. So We have this lovely expression in Texas, where I'm from, called cowboying up. You guys have that? You guys ever heard that? So if you're not being courageous about something, if there's something that you don't want to do, your friends will tell you, come on, just cowboy up, which means just go toughen up and do that thing. And it's a lovely expression, and we use it all the time. So at one point when I was preaching the gospel of possibilityism, someone came up to me afterwards and said, oh, you'd be a great politician because you're not committing to any particular story, and you should just cowboy up and commit to a particular story. Well, I think that's really wrong-headed, because you really do want to ask a cowboy about certain things like, should you take the cattle this way to avoid the storm, or should you sell the ranch, or should you marry that woman, whatever. But you don't necessarily want to ask a cowboy his opinion on, do you think there's extraterrestrial civilizations on other planets? Asking a cowboy as opposed to asking an astrobiologist might be a better bet, right? And if you're not going to ask the cowboy about the deep theological questions, that suggests maybe there are some domains where it's appropriate to cowboy up, and there are other domains where it's a little bit more appropriate to have some intellectual humility, and the important part is not to commit to a particular story in the absence of evidence to do so, but instead to maintain the hypotheses in mind. So, if I have just a few more minutes left, what I would like to do is return to this issue of the God versus no God debate, and just try to very quickly swing a flashlight around the possibility space by reading a few chapters and verses from the Possibilian Gospel, just to give a sense of this. So, I'm going to read from the book of Microbe to start with, the Apostle here. This is a chapter called Microbe. There is no afterlife for us. Our bodies decompose upon death, and then the teeming floods of microbes living inside us move on to better places. This may lead you to assume that God doesn't exist, but you'd be wrong. It's simply that he doesn't know we exist. He is unaware of us because we are at the wrong spatial scale. God is the size of a bacterium. He is not something outside and above us, but on the surface and in the cells of us. God created life in his own image. His congregants are the microbes. The chronic warfare over host territory, the politics of symbiosis and infection, the ascendancy of strains, this is the chessboard of God, where good clashes with evil on the battleground of surface proteins and immunity and resistance. Our presence in this picture is something of an anomaly, since we, the backgrounds upon which they live, don't harm the life patterns of the microbes. We are unnoticed. We are neither selected out by evolution nor captured in God's radar. God and his microbial constituents are unaware of the rich social life that we have developed, of our cities, circuses, and wars. They are as unaware of our level of interaction as we are of theirs. Even while we genuflect and pray, it is only the microbes who are in the running for eternal punishment or reward. Our death is unnoteworthy and unobserved by the microbes, who merely redistribute onto different food sources. So although we supposed ourselves to be the apex of evolution, we are merely the nutritional substrate. But don't despair. We have great power to change the course of their world. Imagine that you choose to eat at a particular restaurant where you unwittingly pass a microbe from your fingers to the salt shaker to the next person sitting at the table, who happens to board an international flight and transport the microbe to Tunisia. To the microbes who have lost a family member. These are the mystifying and often cruel ways in which the universe works. They look to God for answers. God attributes these events to statistical fluctuations over which he has no control and no understanding. now going to read from the Book of Angst. As humans, we spend our time seeking big, meaningful experiences, so the afterlife may surprise you when your body wears out. We expand back into what we really are, which is by Earth standards, enormous. We stand 10,000 kilometers tall in each of 9 dimensions and live with others like us in a celestial commune. When we reawaken in these, our true bodies, we immediately begin to notice that our gargantuan colleagues suffer a deep sense of angst. Our job is the maintenance and upholding of the cosmos. Universal collapse is imminent, and we engineer wormholes to act as structural support. We labor relentlessly on the edge of cosmic disaster. If we don't execute our jobs flawlessly, the universe will recollapse. Ours is important, intricate, and complex work. After 3 centuries of this toil, we have the option to take a vacation. We all choose the same destination. We project ourselves into lower dimensional creatures. We project ourselves into the tiny, delicate bodies that we call humans in 3 dimensions. And we are born onto the resort we call Earth. The idea on such vacations is to capture small experiences. On the Earth, we care only about our immediate surroundings. We watch comedy movies. We drink alcohol and enjoy music. We form relationships, fight, break up, start again. When we're in a human body, we don't care about universal collapse. Instead, we care only about a meeting of the eyes, a glimpse of bare flesh, the caressing tones of a loved voice, joy, love, light, the orientation of a houseplant, the shade of a paint stroke, the arrangement of hair. Those are good vacations we take on Earth, replete with our little dramas and fusses. The mental relaxation is unspeakably precious to us. And when we're forced to leave by the wearing out of those delicate little bodies, it is not uncommon to see us lying prostrate in the breeze of the solar winds, tools in hand, looking out into the cosmos, wet-eyed, searching for meaninglessness. I'm going to read one more, and what you are picking up about the Gospels of Possibilianism is that the stories are all mutually exclusive. This is the Book of Narcissus. In the afterlife, you receive a clear answer about our purpose on Earth. Our mission is to collect data. We have been seeded on this planet as sophisticated mobile cameras. We are equipped with advanced lenses that produce high-resolution visual images, calculating shape and depth from wavelengths of light. The cameras of the eyes are mounted on bodies that carry them around, bodies that can scale mountains, spelunk caves, cross plains. We are outfitted with ears to pick up air compression waves and large sensory sheets of skin to collect temperature and texture data. We have been designed with analytic brains that can get this mobile equipment on top of clouds, below the seas, onto the moon. In this way, each observer from every mountaintop contributes a little piece to the vast collection of planetary surface data. We were planted here by the cartographers, whose holy books are what we would recognize as maps. Our calling is to cover every inch of the planet's surface. As we roam, we vacuum data into our sensory organs, and it is for this reason only that we exist. At the moment of our death, we reawaken in the debriefing room. Here, our lifetime of data collection is downloaded and cross-correlated with the data of those who have passed before us. By this method, the cartographers integrate billions of viewpoints for a dynamic, high-resolution picture of the planet. To ensure that we spread widely on the surface, they made us restless, longing, lusty, and fecund. Unlike previous mobile camera versions, they built us to stand crane our necks, turn our lenses onto every detail of the planet, become curious, and develop new ideas for increased mobility. Our pioneering efforts were not pre-scripted. Instead, we were subjected to natural selection to develop dynamic, unforeseen strategies. The cartographers do not care who lives and dies, as long as there is broad coverage. They are annoyed by worship and genuflection. It slows data collection. When we awaken in the giant spherical windowless room, it may take a few moments to realize that we are not in a heaven in the clouds. Rather, we are deep at the center of the earth. The cartographers are much smaller than we are. They live underground and are averse to light. We are the biggest devices they could build. To them, we are giants, an impressive machine ideal for planetary exploration. Estimating our progress from their control center, the mobile camera engineers congratulated themselves on a job well done. They pushed out humans onto the surface and waited for them to spend lifetimes turning their data centers on patches of ground, the strata of rocks, the distribution of trees. And yet, despite the initial success, the cartographers are profoundly frustrated with the results. Despite the planetary coverage and long lifespans, the mobile cameras collect very little that is useful for cartography. Instead, the devices turn their ingeniously created compact lenses directly into the gazes of other compact lenses. An ironic way to trivialize the technology. On their sophisticated sensory skin, they simply want to be stroked. The brilliant air compression sensors are turned toward the whispers of lovers rather than critical planetary data. Despite their robust outdoor design, they have spent their energies building shelters into which they cluster with one another. Despite good spreading on large scales, they clump at small scales. They build communication networks to view pictures of one another remotely when they are apart. Day after day, with sinking hearts, the cartographers scroll through endless reels of useless data. The head engineer is fired. He has created an engineering marvel that only takes pictures of itself. One thing you'll notice about the Gospels of the Possibilianism is they're all meant to be equally improbable stories. What they're meant to do is shine a flashlight around the possibility space. So my message to you today is to go back out in the world and feel comfortable with holding multiple possibilities in mind. Because given the vastness of our ignorance, there's no other way to go about this. And the plea is not just for simple open-mindedness, but it's for an active exploration of new ideas. It's to use what we already know and springboard off that and come up with new possibilities. I think it's possible to live a dogma-free life, one that's full of awe and wonder and appreciation, and I think it's possible to celebrate the vastness of our ignorance and praise uncertainty. Thank you very much. you.